pulled over for no reason, followed from store to store by security guards, overlooked in the emergency room. Racial profiling in Ontario is not just a concern in policing, it's a problem for both public institutions and the private sector. That's according to a new report from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. It's called Under Suspicion, Research and Consultation Report on Racial Profiling in Ontario, and it brings Chief Commissioner Renu Mandhane back to our studio tonight. Nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to know what prompted the research for this report in the first place.
So we've done a lot of work on racism and racial discrimination, and what we've heard over the last few years is that racial profiling is a very particular form of discrimination that isn't often well understood by the institutions who are trying to address it. So we were going to do a policy and guidelines for institutions on how to identify racial profiling and what to do about it. And to do that, we did consultation. Well, we don't always release our consultation reports. Sometimes they're just for our internal purposes to move on with the work. But this one I read and I just said, we just have to put this out into the world. It's so rich, it's so interesting, and it really lends a different dimension to this conversation.
You were really out there. I mean, from what I hear, more than 1,600 different consultation points, yes?
Yes.
That's a lot. Well, here's what we learned in your report. If we could, Sheldon, bring this up. Concerns about racial profiling are broader than policing. Racialized and Indigenous peoples may experience unwarranted heightened scrutiny in education, stores, shopping malls, housing and workplaces, on buses, subways and trains, at airports and border crossings, in healthcare, and by private security and child welfare agencies. Before we go any further on this, I know there are people who are watching this right now who are not from racialized or Indigenous communities, who are thinking to themselves, well, this is not me. I don't do this. I'm not a racist. So we're going to scratch a little bit below the surface here. Give us an example of the kind of heightened scrutiny that you think targeted groups go through that maybe the rest of us are not hip to.
Yeah, so what we heard is that often it isn't because an individual is actually acting out of a malicious intent. It's part of our unconscious bias, but also the structures and policies that we have in place that target certain people. So I'll give you an example. So we talked to an Indigenous midwife who works in the North, and she said that her experience is that if she's attending on the birth of an Indigenous woman who's young, maybe unmarried, invariably, hospital will call child welfare agencies to flag this as a possibly risky situation. Yet she doesn't see that for, in a similar circumstance involving a non-Indigenous woman. We heard about a Black woman whose husband had bought her a very nice car, a Jaguar, in fact. And when she was driving it, she actually told her husband, I can't drive this car anymore. I get pulled over so often that clearly I need, and this was her words, a more Black appropriate vehicle.
What does that even mean?
I guess in her words, that somehow a Jaguar and a Black driver didn't seem to fit, and she was pulled over so often asking about it, to see her vehicle registration. Is she the driver and is she the owner? So these kinds of experiences sort of show that this is happening at some unconscious level, but it is very real for the people we talk to. And the other thing I would say is that what you hear a lot about carding and the rest of it is, and from non-racialized communities, is kind of like, really, is this that big a deal? Like, if you haven't done anything wrong, can't you just show your ID and move on? Like, why are you out in the streets? And I think what this report shows is that that's almost the tip of the iceberg. Like, this is an experience from the minute you get on public transit, when you go run your errands, when you go to work. And so it's an unrelenting experience. It's not just like, a couple times a year being stopped and asked for your identification.
No, we should all be able to live under the presumption that we're not guilty of anything,
exactly.
Right? I mean, that's the gist of it. Is it problematic to refer to this as racial profiling when things also such as religion were also identified as reasons for discrimination?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and we've had that question a lot. Like, some people say, is it religious profiling? But what we know is that often race is the way people get into this type of profiling. So, for example, if you're Middle Eastern or if you're brown, like me, people assume that you're Muslim. So regardless of whether you are or you aren't, you're profiled because of your race becomes a proxy for a perceived religion. So, I mean, you know, if you're a white Muslim person walking down the street, the chances are you don't face the same kinds of stereotypes as somebody who looks more stereotypically Muslim, I guess.
A language thing here, if I may. You just said if you're brown like me, so you're allowed to say that. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, it's funny. I try and not get too hung up on labels. I mean, I think a lot of it's about the intention behind the label.
But
And
am I allowed to say in describing you, I say, you know, if somebody's brown like you, am I allowed to say that?
you're allowed to say it to me. I mean, I think that I don't get too hung up on those things, but I think that why people have tended to now start to use, again, black, brown, white, is because, you know, we sometimes say African Canadian, and then people of Caribbean origin say, well, I'm not an African Canadian.
Right. Okay, gotcha. This next graphic I want to bring up is really, really interesting because you looked at how people who experience racial profiling are affected by repeated experiences. And there we are. Look at this. We're going to look at the blue bars on the left first, and you can see the negative mental health effects, the negative physical health effects, decreased trust in police, decreased trust in the law and justice system, decreased sense of belonging and trust in society. It's all at one particular level when it happens once. But look at those bars, those orange bars to the right of each of them, and you can see how it just exponentially goes up when these kinds of things happen repeatedly. And I wonder how all of the negative consequences associated with repeated experiences manifest themselves.
Yeah, so this is really a societal issue. This isn't an issue just about the people who are impacted, because what the research really shows is that the more this happens to you, the more distrustful you become about public institutions. So we want to believe that if you're a racialized person and you see a crime happening, or you're worried about a child in your neighborhood, that you will call the authorities to report that. But what this research suggests is if you yourself have been profiled a number of times, you become more hesitant to actually trust that those agencies are going to be able to deal with those issues in an impartial, non-discriminatory manner, and you may be actually less likely to report. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, and I think we've seen that, you know, with police, with high-profile shootings where no witnesses come forward, and the police sort of say, "Hey, this happened in your neighborhood. Like, why is nobody coming forward?" And what this research suggests is some of that is about a lack of trust in those very institutions.
Well, on the other hand, we had a mob hit in Waterdown the other day, and you know people aren't coming forward on that one for obvious reasons.
Yeah,
different reasons, but obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Let's put up another chart here, and this is one, Sheldon. You'll see here. I mean, policing. Yes, we've all heard stories about, you know, racial profiling as it relates to the police, but the police are not alone in this one. I mean, private business or retail service. A third mentioned that one as well, or then employment. Almost 3 in 10. Issues on transportation systems, be it by the bus, subway, train, or airport. In the education system, we've certainly heard a lot about that lately, particularly in York region, almost 1 in 5. Private security, mall security, you know, go down the list. It's not just the cops, right?
Yeah, it's certainly not just the cops. And if you kind of take the number of private security and private business, that's actually a bigger number if you put those together than the cops. So what this is really suggesting is that there's a lot of areas in life where this is happening. I think why we focused on the cops or the police, law enforcement in the past, is because the impact on liberty and potentially even loss of life is so extreme that it's a sector that requires that kind of attention. But you know, what we also heard in the report with private security, for example, is once you get picked up, for example, by a private security guard, often they will call the police. So that is an entryway into criminalization. So, and private security also really impacts youth. So we heard a lot about, you know, kids in malls who hang out, and if you're a black kid in a mall in a group, you draw the attention of security in a different way. And that can usher in, again, a whole process of interactions with the state that don't look the same as they might for a white youth.
At an airport, what's the brown guy room?
So we heard that some people have been subjected to secondary screening by Canadian Border Services Agency so many times that in their community, when you have to wait in that room for your secondary screening, people colloquially call it, quote unquote, the brown guy room, because they kind of look around and see who's sitting in the room with them.
No white guys in that room.
And you know, my husband's South Asian. A couple people in our office have, you know, South Asian male partners. And this is a kind of a known phenomenon. We might not have exactly the numbers, but certainly when somebody in the report says, if you get pulled over every time for random screening, it stops feeling very random. So, you know, it's hard to know. One thing we say in the report is you can never kind of really say, is this because of racial profiling? Is this because of something else? That causation is hard to prove. But I think what is important is that if people perceive that it's because of racial profiling, because it happens so regularly, it still has that distrust factor, regardless of whether it's intentional or not.
I want to do another example, and this one comes from the healthcare sector. And I'll tell you, in that chair a couple of months ago was an Indigenous academic woman who had, I think at the time, an adverse reaction to some kind of medication, was brought by her husband unconscious into an ER in Saskatchewan, I believe. And the reaction from the attending nurse was, you know, oh, she hung over again? Or she, you know,
yeah,
she get drunk again?
Yeah.
Another drunken Indian again? I mean, it was that kind of a thing. This happens in healthcare too, doesn't it?
Yeah, so we heard a lot mostly from Indigenous people, and we did some consultations in Northwestern Ontario, and we heard a lot about the healthcare sector and the kinds of negative stereotypes that follow Indigenous people when they seek primary care, and much of it that all of their health problems somehow relate to an underlying addiction, alcoholism. And I think what's interesting in the report is you see how different stereotypes play out for different people. So in the Indigenous sector, we heard a lot about child welfare and healthcare and policing as the core issues. For the Black community, it was policing, retail, child welfare. For South Asians, it was transportation, all of the profiling around being a terrorist. So the stereotypes actually lead to profiling in different sectors. And we didn't really hear from South Asians' problems in the healthcare sector because the stereotypes didn't play out in that sector in the same way. So,
I hear you, but just pick up on transportation for a sector. You know, critics are going to say there's a reason why, quote unquote, you know, the brown guy room exists, because 99% of the people who are committing terrorist acts are brown guys.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's a certain mathematical logic to it all. I mean, what would you say to those folks?
Well, a couple things. First of all, there's actually no research that we're aware of that says that. So,
no, but you watch the news, and that's certainly the impression you get.
Exactly, I'll just pick up on that's the impression you get. I think that a lot of this isn't actually based in research that shows that there's an actual higher propensity to commit crime or terrorism or the rest of it. And in fact, I think in the US, they've actually found that most of the mass shootings have not been committed by Muslim people, but rather by, you know, radicalized
white guys from the Michigan militia, for sure.
So, and we just don't talk about those things in the same way. We talk about mental illness, we talk about exclusion, but when it's a Muslim or brown person, we talk about radicalization and Islam. So there's sort of a story there. But the other thing I think is really important is, you know, we did the Ottawa Police Service did a data collection project out of a settlement with us, and they collected data on traffic stops and how they played out by race. And what the data after a 3-year period found was that Black people were likely to be stopped 8 times more often, and Middle Eastern people 12 times more often. And what they found was they actually didn't have a higher propensity to actually end up being charged with a traffic offense in the end. So, you know, being really crass, they weren't worse drivers. So something else was going on.
Well, I got a clip on that right here, because it speaks to the unconscious bias that you referred to earlier. And we did a program on this not too long ago. I want to play a clip of Shakil Chaudhry, who's the author of, I'm sure you know him, Deep Diversity was the book he came out with about our brain's unconscious racial biases. Sheldon, roll it, please.
According to the data, when we looked at lots of these things of meta-analysis, is that I've read that up to 50% of Black people have a pro-white, anti-Black bias. 70% of whites, Latinos, and Asian Americans, Asian Canadians as well, have a pro-white, anti-black bias. So this is something that affects us, again, both consciously and unconsciously. And unconsciously is where we're having to deal with in society today, because that's what results in systemic discrimination and racism that is pervasive, but it's so subtle and hard to detect because vast majority of society, we see ourselves as well-intentioned, thoughtful, and people who care about fairness and justice.
That's the old set, longer ago than I thought. Anyway, okay, conscious bias, education, etc., public pressure, we can do something about that. Unconscious bias? What are we going to do about that?
So a few things. What I want to just say, and I want to admit myself, everyone has unconscious bias. I'm the Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission. I have unconscious bias.
Against whom?
Well, just about, any time your brain sort of makes an assumption, I actually check myself and go, why did I think that? Interesting. Well, that's an interesting process my brain just went through. I'm going to dial that back and actually apply reason to my own unconscious bias. So there are actually ways of addressing unconscious bias, ways of training yourself to recognize unconscious bias. But the second thing that's really important is the systemic aspect that Shaquille talked about. What we're saying in this report is, this is not about you as an individual being a horrible person or being labeled a racist. This is about a society where very early on in life, we learn who is to be trusted and who isn't, through media, through interactions with our families, through the school system. And that's why another priority for the Commission beyond this work is to actually work and think about the education system and how do we get kids at their youngest age to really understand inclusion, human rights, rights and responsibilities, so that we aren't waiting until you have a 35-year-old officer and saying, hey, you need to untrain your brain over knowledge that's really gained through osmosis over your whole lifetime.
The fact is, it's not in the DNA. You got to learn that, right?
Yeah.
You got to pick that up. Let's do here's an excerpt from your report. In terms of addressing racial profiling, we are at a critical juncture in Ontario. Ontario is becoming more racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse, and yet increasingly economically stratified. Many institutions in society are becoming more focused on assessing potential threats to safety, citing concerns about terrorism and violence. What, if anything, do you think the Government of Ontario can do to ensure that addressing public safety concerns don't lead to increased racial profiling?
So the first thing I would say, and what we've tried to say, is actually engaging in non-discriminatory practices, we think increases public safety. It makes people feel more included in society. It makes them want to cooperate with public institutions. So this is should be a good for everyone. The other thing is that our current government has actually made pretty serious commitments to uncovering the kind of systemic discrimination we're talking about. So the new Anti-Racism Directorate, there will be legislation that will mandate data collection in policing, in corrections, child welfare, and education. And what we hope is that that kind of data collection will allow us to actually step back from that immediately defensive, I'm not a racist, kind of response to something that says, you know what, this is in a lot of different systems, and we need to actually think creatively about where it's happening and how to tackle it.
I've got about a minute and a half to go, and I want to ask about Ford Nation. I want to ask about Donald Trump supporters. I want to ask about the people who used the N-word at Fenway Park earlier this week when the Baltimore Orioles came to town and a black outfielder was on the receiving end of some disgusting, vicious racial epithets. And I want to ask about, Hillary supporters who also have this, racism coursing through their veins as well that they may not want to appreciate or understand. How do you think we're going to make progress on this at the end of the day? Because here we are in 2017, and this still exists way too much.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult time. I would say even, we've taken stands on things like religious accommodation that have given me personally, I have never been so vilified, hated by online trolls. I think that we have to remember that we have a set of core values. They're in our charter, they're in our human rights code, and we need to treat people respectfully. The answer to all of this isn't that we're all going to go back to where we came from. You know, I was born in Canada. I want a place in this society, and I want to contribute to this society. And I think we have to remember that the solutions can't be that we all retract and retrench into, you know, some historic community, that this is our community, and we actually have to commit to that as a concept.
There are millions of people out there who don't agree with you and don't believe in what you've just described. How are you going to get to them?
I don't know that we will get to all of those people, but I do hope that we get to the people who maybe agree with me, but haven't been vocally agreeing with me. So, you know, there's a lot of people who think, yeah, I agree with you. What you're saying makes sense. I'm not going to take any steps to put that opinion out into the world. And I really hope that we can, because what we've seen on some of the issues the Commission works on is when the public gets engaged and really says, you know what, this is an issue we care about, that's when we see action. It's not when the Commission leads the change. It's when the Commission empowers the public to lead the change.
Which they actually did at Fenway Park.
Yes.
The day after.
Exactly.
They gave a standing ovation to the Oriole player who'd been targeted.
That is way more powerful than a Human Rights Commission saying, you know, don't do that.
Well, having said that, we're happy that the Human Rights Commission's Chief Commissioner came in today and shared some time with us tonight on TVO. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.